We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things.
I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all.
In July 1969, the world held its breath as Neil Armstrong stepped onto the Sea of Tranquility, declaring humanity's first footprints on another world. The images, the triumph, the flags and footprints etched in lunar dust told a story of triumph, ambition, and the pinnacle of engineering. But beneath the dazzling spectacle, the moon was never just a lifeless rock waiting to be conquered. Decades later, Apollo 16 astronaut Charles Duke is now rumored to have said that he knows why we never returned to the moon. This is one ride you can't miss: Kennedy, the Cold War, and the moon race. In October 1957, the world jolted awake when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. The tiny beeping sphere was a technological marvel. However, the United States, long confident in its industrial and military supremacy, suddenly felt exposed. A year and a half later, in April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth, his Vostok 1 capsule circling the globe in 108 minutes. The Soviets had struck first, and America had been caught flat-footed. John F. Kennedy, a young president barely 2 years into office, understood the urgency. Standing in the cool white halls of the Oval Office, he weighed the political and technological realities. The Soviet Union had a head start, but America had resources, ingenuity, and a workforce capable of monumental feats. In May 1961, Kennedy delivered a speech before a joint session of Congress. "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." With those words, the moon became a stage, a proving ground, a symbol that industrial might and democratic ideology could triumph in a world increasingly defined by technological spectacle. Behind the rhetoric, NASA faced a mountain of challenges. The agency had barely matured, created in 1958 to coordinate America's space efforts, and yet it was tasked with achieving what no human had ever attempted. Mercury missions, beginning in 1961 with Alan Shepard's 15-minute suborbital flight, laid the groundwork for human spaceflight. John Glenn's 1962 orbital flight pushed endurance limits, proving Americans could live and work in orbit. By 1965, the Gemini program was underway, perfecting rendezvous and docking procedures and simulating extended lunar missions. Meanwhile, in Huntsville, Alabama, engineers labored over what would become the Saturn V rocket. At 363 feet tall and weighing 6.5 million pounds fully fueled, it was the most powerful launch vehicle ever conceived. Its F1 engines, each producing 1.5 million pounds of thrust, roared with a fury unmatched on Earth. Teams at the Marshall Space Flight Center worked around the clock, integrating propulsion, guidance systems, and structural engineering. In Cape Canaveral, launch crews rehearsed countdowns and emergency procedures with obsessive precision. NASA's ambition was audacious, and the risk was enormous. A single miscalculation could incinerate millions of dollars of equipment and, more importantly, human lives. Across the Atlantic and the Ural Mountains, the Soviet Union quietly pursued its own lunar agenda. Their lunar program, beginning in 1959, aimed to achieve robotic landings, orbiters, and sample returns. Missions: Luna 1 through 14 tested engines, guidance systems, and communications under a veil of secrecy. The Soviets celebrated successes, like Luna 2 impacting the Moon in September 1959, and mourned failures, including Luna 15's crash in July 1969, just 3 days before Apollo 11 touched down. Back in the United States, the pace accelerated as the 1960s unfolded. Gemini astronauts rehearsed every conceivable contingency in water tanks, wind tunnels, and simulators. Lunar modules were tested in full-scale mock-ups, their spider-like legs engineered to absorb impact while keeping delicate equipment intact. The United States was pouring billions into rockets, spacecraft, and human capital. The Apollo program would ultimately consume $24 billion. That's more than $200 billion today. Apollo missions, triumphs, and near disasters. The summer of 1969 carried the weight of the world into space. On July 16th, the Saturn V rocket lifted off from Kennedy Space Center, carrying Apollo 11 and the dreams of a planet eager for triumph. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were strapped inside, hurtling toward the moon at 25,000 miles per hour. The world watched, breathless, as the United States aimed not just to land a man on the moon, but to etch itself into the annals of history. 8 days later, Armstrong descended the lunar module ladder, his boots pressing into the fine grey dust. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," he said, a voice steady over the crackling radio. To him, and to engineers at NASA, the accomplishment was monumental. Armstrong later called the Apollo 11 spacecraft the greatest engineering feat of the 20th century. However, the mission was not without peril. After Armstrong and Aldrin's historic moonwalk, they prepared to return to the command module. A critical issue emerged. The lunar module's ascent engine circuit breaker, responsible for firing the engine to lift off the moon, had been accidentally broken off. Failure to engage it would have stranded the astronauts on the lunar surface. Aldrin, thinking fast, inserted a felt-tip pen into the gap, manually closing the circuit. The engine ignited without issue, carrying the astronauts safely into lunar orbit, a simple improvisation that averted potential disaster. Their challenges continued on the way home. Splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, scheduled with precision, collided with adverse weather, pushing the module 13 miles off target from the recovery ship USS Hornet. Rescue crews scrambled, but ultimately, Apollo 11 returned to Earth with all 3 astronauts unharmed. 3 years later, Apollo 16 lifted off on April 16, 1972, carrying Charles Duke, John Young, and Ken Mattingly to the moon. Duke, the 10th man to walk on the lunar surface, and Young spent 71 hours exploring the Descartes Highlands. By every official metric, the mission was flawless. NASA would call it one of the most successful Apollo flights ever. But then, America abandoned the lunar frontier. Before we move on to why, let's first consider this: technological feats and hidden innovations. The Apollo 11 spacesuits, known formally as the A7L models, were marvels of ingenuity and necessity. Each suit, custom-fitted to Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, cost roughly $100,000 at the time, equivalent to $670,000 today. Designed to withstand the moon's punishing temperatures, from a blistering 240 degrees Fahrenheit in sunlight to a frigid minus 280 degrees in shadow, these suits were the thin line between life and vacuum. Yet the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Playtex, a company known for brass and girdles, collaborated with the International Latex Corporation in Dover, Delaware, to develop the suit's mobility. NASA's engineers understood protection and insulation, but flexibility in a vacuum-resistant pressurized suit, that was a puzzle. Playtex's intimate knowledge of stretch fabrics allowed astronauts to bend, kneel, and manipulate tools on the lunar surface without compromising the integrity of the suit. The suits also incorporated layers of aluminized mylar, Teflon, and beta cloth, each designed to reflect radiation, resist micrometeoroid punctures, and provide thermal insulation, creating a mobile fortress around a human body in a vacuum 240,000 miles from home. Even the suit's greatest innovation, however, would later face a new adversary: lunar dust. Far from the soft powder one might imagine, lunar regolith is abrasive, composed of jagged shards of glass and rock created over eons by micrometeorite impacts. Without wind or water to erode these edges, every particle is sharp, capable of tearing through fabric and scratching equipment. And these particles are not merely mechanical threats. They carry electrical charges from solar radiation. When astronauts move across the surface, dust clings to suits, helmets, and tools, interfering with seals, electronics, and vision. Apollo missions often ended with spacesuits coated in this stubborn grey dust, which entered spacecraft cabins. This threatened both equipment and human health. NASA learned early that prolonged lunar missions would require something far beyond the technology of 1969 suits. Enter carbon nanotubes and electrodynamic dust shields. These concepts were developed decades later, but were rooted in the lessons of Apollo. Carbon nanotubes can be woven into the outer layers of spacesuits to create electrodes. By generating controlled electrical fields, these surfaces repel charged dust particles, keeping them from sticking to the suit. Prototype knee joints tested with simulated lunar dust removed up to 96% of particles, suggesting a path toward long-term lunar exploration without the crippling hazards of abrasive regolith. In future missions, astronauts could spend hundreds of hours outside the habitat, conducting extensive scientific work. The technology remains experimental, but it is a direct evolution from Apollo's hard-won lessons. However, none of this would have mattered if the vehicles carrying astronauts into space were unreliable. The Saturn V rocket, the most powerful rocket ever built, embodied both ambition and peril. Towering 363 feet, it could lift 140,000 kilograms into low Earth orbit, yet achieving that raw power required decades of engineering, testing, and nerve-wracking trials. The Apollo 6 test flight in 1968 nearly ended in catastrophe. Multiple engines failed, the second stage misfired, and the enormous rocket's vibrations threatened structural failure. Engineers on the ground feared an explosion that would have vaporized everything within a mile. Through a combination of redundancy in design and rapid corrective action, Saturn V completed the flight without loss of life. Apollo 11's crew would later ride that same type of rocket to their historic landing, oblivious to how close previous tests had come to failure. But Apollo 11 did land on the moon, and the feat was repeated multiple times. So why did NASA refuse to return to the celestial frontier all these years? Charles Duke's claims about the moon's hidden mysteries. Apollo 16. Astronaut Charles Moss, Duke Jr., joined NASA in 1966 and quickly distinguished himself for his technical acumen and composure under pressure. He served as Capcom, the astronaut who communicated directly with crews for Apollo 11, famously guiding Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin during humanity's first steps on the moon in July 1969. Just 3 years later, Duke would command his own mission, Apollo 16, launched on April 16, 1972, where he spent 71 hours on the lunar surface alongside mission commander John Young in the Descartes Highlands. Over the decades, Duke rose to the rank of Air Force Brigadier General, accumulating thousands of flight hours. In recent years, stories have emerged claiming that Duke revealed strange discoveries on the moon, such as geometric structures in the Descartes Highlands, mysterious lights, unexplained sounds, and even the sensation of being watched. These accounts are often framed as revelations Duke supposedly shared in late career interviews, but when those claims are traced back to verified recordings, published interviews, and NASA archives, a different story emerges. Duke himself spoke extensively about his experiences on the moon. During an oral history interview with NASA, he described the moment he stepped onto the lunar surface in April 1972 with unmistakable awe rather than mystery. "The scenery up there is just fantastic," he said when recalling the Descartes Highlands. "You'd have to be there to see this to believe it." In the same discussion, Duke emphasized how alien yet beautiful the landscape appeared. Jagged mountains, grey dust stretching to the horizon, and Earth hanging as a blue-white sphere in the black sky. In other public talks reflecting on the mission, Duke spoke about the emotional impact of being on another world. "I'm on the moon," he once said, while recalling the moment, and the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all. It was just unbelievable. These statements echo the feelings many Apollo astronauts described after returning from the lunar surface, overwhelming awe at both the moon's stark environment and the fragile beauty of Earth seen from space. However, when asked directly about extraterrestrial discoveries or mysterious structures, Duke's answers were consistent. He repeatedly said that he never encountered alien artifacts or evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence during the Apollo missions. In interviews and public lectures, he explained plainly that the Apollo astronauts saw nothing that suggested artificial structures or alien technology on the moon. This stands in stark contrast to the viral narrative circulating online, which claims Duke described geometric walls or foundations roughly 6 kilometers from the Apollo 16 landing site in the Descartes Highlands. According to those internet accounts, Duke allegedly reported the structures to Mission Control and photographed them, only for the images to be classified or hidden. Yet no such statements appear in the mission transcripts, NASA archives, or Duke's own published memoirs. The same pattern appears with other claims attributed to him, such as seeing colored light in the lunar sky, hearing unexplained tones in the vacuum of space, or experiencing distortions in time. Misquotation of astronauts is not a new phenomenon. Over the decades, comments by Apollo veterans have often been clipped or taken out of context to support sensational claims. Buzz Aldrin once described seeing an unidentified object on the way to the moon, later clarifying it was likely a panel from the Saturn V rocket. Edgar Mitchell also shared his belief that intelligent life likely exists in the universe, though online posts miscast this as proof of alien encounters during Apollo program missions. Such distortions show how fragments of astronaut testimony become exaggerated, while the historical record reflects astronauts describing one of humanity's greatest explorations. During the mission, he and Commander John Young spent roughly 71 hours on the lunar surface, traveling nearly 27 kilometers in the lunar roving vehicle and collecting 95 kilograms of lunar samples. When Duke later reflected on the experience, the mystery he described was not about alien structures, but about perspective. Seeing Earth from the moon changed the way he thought about humanity itself. When you see the Earth from the moon, he once explained in a public talk, you realize how small and fragile it is. The persistence of such rumors is tied to another long-running narrative, the claim that the moon landings themselves were staged. The moon landing hoax theory began circulating in the 1970s and gained renewed attention with the 1976 book, We Never Went to the Moon, by Bill Kaysing. The theory argues that NASA faked the Apollo landings for Cold War propaganda. However, the evidence overwhelmingly contradicts this claim. Hundreds of thousands of engineers, technicians, and contractors worked on the Apollo program across the United States. The massive Saturn V rocket was launched publicly from Kennedy Space Center, with independent observatories and even Soviet stations tracking the spacecraft to the moon. Apollo missions returned about 382 kilograms of lunar samples, studied worldwide and chemically distinct from Earth rocks. Astronomical evidence also supports the missions. Reflectors placed on the moon during Apollo 11, Apollo 14, and Apollo 15 allow scientists to bounce lasers off the surface and measure the Earth-Moon distance with centimeter precision, a practice still done today. If Apollo was real, the next question follows. Why did humans stop going after Apollo 17 in December 1972? Let's unveil the real reason now. Why NASA stopped returning to the moon, and why they want to return now. By the end of 1972, humanity had stepped onto the moon 6 times, leaving footprints, flags, and experiments on its grey, dusty surface. The Apollo program had accomplished what had once seemed impossible. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the Sea of Tranquility in July 1969. Apollo 16's John Young and Charles Duke spent 71 hours in the Descartes Highlands in April 1972, and Apollo 17's Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt brought the last humans home in December 1972. But then, abruptly, NASA stopped sending people back. Officially, it wasn't a mystery. The Apollo program had cost the United States $25.4 billion in 1973 dollars, which is roughly $170 billion today, funded by a nation fatigued from war in Vietnam and facing domestic economic challenges. Political and public interest had waned. The moon had been won in the Cold War sense. Focus shifted toward Earth orbit programs like the Space Shuttle, first launched in 1981, the Hubble Space Telescope, deployed in 1990, and the International Space Station, whose construction began in 1998. The moon, once the ultimate frontier, became a dormant ambition. Now the race is returning. NASA is preparing to go back using the Space Launch System, or SLS, designed as the most powerful rocket ever built to carry crews and heavy cargo beyond Earth orbit. Through the Artemis program, NASA aims to land astronauts near the lunar South Pole in the mid-2020s and lay the foundation for a sustained human presence on the Moon. A key driver behind renewed lunar interest is the Moon's potential resources. The Moon is increasingly viewed as a potential source of valuable resources. One of the most discussed is helium-3, a rare isotope present in lunar soil that could theoretically fuel clean nuclear fusion with minimal radioactive waste. The Moon also contains metals such as titanium, aluminum, iron, and rare earth elements critical for electronics and advanced technologies. These resources could support both the lunar industry and future off-world infrastructure. However, mining raises major legal questions. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty prohibits nations from claiming celestial bodies, leaving ownership and regulation of lunar resources unresolved. Long-term human presence would also require solving environmental challenges, particularly abrasive, electrically charged lunar dust that can damage equipment and spacesuits. NASA is testing electrodynamic dust shields and advanced materials to counter this problem. As governments and private companies prepare new missions, the Moon represents both opportunity and uncertainty, an environment rich in resources but still demanding technological innovation and international cooperation. In the future, whoever colonizes the Moon wins the race to global dominance. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.